I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to our Dvarim series titled Torah from Our Teachers. Moshe is our greatest human teacher, and the book of Dvarim includes his monumental addresses to the nation. Each week, our guests will share with us Torah learned from their most influential teachers. This week's episode has been sponsored by Elisheva Horowitz in commemoration of the 9th yahrzeit of her mother, Esther Yocheved Bar Chaya Leah Gershon. She was a woman of great compassion, generosity, and wisdom who had a very special love for the land of Israel and the people of Israel. Her yahrzeit is on the 11th of Av, August 15th. To sponsor an episode, please contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or contact the Matan office directly. Parshat V'Etchanan opens while Moshe is still deep in the first part of his address to the people, the historical oration. Already, the second chapter of the Parsha opens the second and largest portion of Moshe's address, Ne'um HaMitzvot, or the Commandments Address. Here we have general warnings to keep the mitzvot, Moshe's recitation of the 10 Commandments, the first parsha of Shema, of V'ahavta, and the parsha ends with the doctrine of chosenness, of being an Am Segula. Today's guest is Ilana Kurshan, translator and author of the lauded If All the Seas Were Ink, a memoir about her experience learning Daf Yomi and its intersection with her life. She has translated books of Jewish interest by Ruth Calderon, Rav Benjamin Lau, and Micha Goodman, as well as novels, short stories, and children's picture books. She is a regular contributor to Lilith magazine, where she is the book reviews editor. Most recently, Ilana translated the amazing Parsha books by Emily Amarusi, and she is currently working on a memoir about reading sacred and secular literature with her kids called Children of the Book. Ilana Kurshan, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I am a longtime fan of your podcast. So thank you.
I love that. And I also say that I really always have my eyes out for people who are both really attuned learners of text and amazing writers. And I just want to put that compliment out here that you're someone who really represents that for me. It's been so many years since my degrees in literature, but it's still like a deep passion of mine. Even if I'm not spending a lot of time writing, when I see great writing, I don't think there's a lot else that moves me as deeply as phenomenal writing. So thank you for putting out such great work in the world and also making accessible works in Hebrew that, to be able to have those skills in both areas is really a gift. So just want to thank you for putting all of that great work out in the world.
Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we jump into the Parsha?
Okay, great. So I want to focus on the beginning of the Parsha, on what is arguably the most passionate and personal moment in Sefer Dvarim. And it's Moshe's account of his pleading with God to let him enter the land, V'etchanan el Adonai. Moshe's recounting of his dialogue with God is so fervently rendered that we tend to forget it's not a soliloquy. Moshe's speaking to an audience here. And that audience, of course, is Bnei Israel. And he's telling the people about God's refusal to allow him to enter the land. And more than that, he's really blaming the people directly. Vayitaber Adonai bi lema'anchem. God was angry with me on your account, he tells the people, right? It's your fault. And the midrash picks up on this unusual word for anger, vayitaber. In one of the earliest midrashim on Sefer Dvarim, the Sifrei, Midrash Tanaim from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Eretz Yisrael, in the midrash, Rabbi Yoshua connects the word vayitaber with its root, evra, meaning anger. He connects it with the word ibur, meaning pregnancy. And Rabbi Yoshua reads vayitaber as referring to, he says, Ki isha she'ena yachola lasuach mipnei ubara, like a woman who can't engage, who can't converse because of the pain of her pregnancy. And it's such an apt term to describe Moshe, who has really carried the people around with him for so long that he is just at this point completely at the end of his tether. And this term, the term ibur, it's such an interesting word because it's used by Chazal to refer to pregnancy also metaphorically. So we think about ibur shana is like adding a month to a year to make it a leap year because you're expanding the year. So it's 13 months, not 12 months. Or the Gemara in Eruvin talks about ketzad me'abrin et ha'arim, how to expand the boundaries of a city with reference to Tchum Shabbat, where again, this ibur it's like impregnating the city. And it's Rabbi Yoshua maybe explaining Moshe's invocation of this term, right, in Vayitaber Adonai Bi, as signifying that it's like God impregnated Moshe with Bnei Israel, pushing Moshe to expand beyond his ordinary capacity, and to bear the Israelites through the wilderness until they reach full term, right, on the brink of the land. I think the midrash is really picking up on something, on the connection between Moshe and pregnancy. Moshe himself uses this metaphor, right, famously earlier in the Torah in Parshat Balotcha, when Bnei Israel come to a place known as it's called Kivrat HaTa'ava, which is a very, very, very appropriate, right? Literally Kivrot HaTa'ava, the graves of craving, right? Great place to invoke a pregnancy metaphor, where the people are complaining again, as they tend to throughout the Midbar experience, right? They're complaining about the man, and how they're sick of the man and wishing they had basar and wishing they had meat to eat. And Moshe, who is completely distressed, he's frustrated with the people's incessant demands. Moshe cries out to God, and Moshe says, "Lama hariota lavdecha velama lo matzati chen be'inecha lasumet masa kol ha'am hazeh alai." Right? Why have you been so bad to me, hariota? Right? Why have you been so bad to me, God? Why have I not found favor in your eyes that you've burdened me with the people? Moshe says. And he then says immediately after, he says, "Anochi hariti et kol ha'am hazeh im anochi yeliditiv ki tomar elai se'eu v'chekecha kasher yisaho men atayonik." Was I pregnant with these people, right? Did I give birth to these people? Moshe says in his tremendous frustration that you, God, have told me to carry them around like a nursemaid carries around a nursing baby, right? It's like for Moshe, the people are this almost like an unwanted pregnancy that's so burdensome for him that he expresses a death wish, right? Lo uchal anochi levadi laseit et kol ha'am hazeh ki chaved mimeni, he says in the very next pasuk. I can't literally bear, right? Bear, as in bearing a pregnancy. I can't bear this anymore. And right, reaching a climax, this outburst reaches its climax in his death wish. Moshe is beyond overwhelmed. And Rashi on this very pasuk, right? Rashi says, well, in the next pasuk, Rashi says, "V'im kacha at oseli hargeni naharog," right? Kill me, God, if you're going to do this to me. And the Rashi picks up on the use of that feminine form, at, when Moshe is talking to God, and says, right, the strange feminine. Why feminine? Tashash kocho shel Moshe kinekeva. Like Moshe's strength weakens like a woman, right? Moshe just could not bear this anymore, and his exasperation with the people and with laboring the people finds its echo again at the beginning of Sefer Dvarim, when Moshe says, right, the pasuk that we famously recite in the trope of Echa, right? Echa sa livadi tarchechem umasechem v'rivchem. Like, how can I carry you alone? He recounts having told the people, right? Moshe, I think what we're seeing here is Moshe really has always been a very ambivalent mother, if you will. And initially he was very resistant to taking on his role, right? He repeatedly tried to get out of it at the burning bush in the beginning of Sefer Shmot. And he's come to care very deeply and very devotedly for his charges, but not without tremendous ambivalence and many moments when he's really thrown into crisis, like almost at a breaking point, right? I'm thinking of, in Sefer Shmot, after the whole episode with the golden calf, when Moshe is really, right, he's frustrated with the people, but he also has come to really care for them very deeply, and he becomes their advocate to God after the incident with the Egel. And God says to him, okay, Moshe, I see that this has been, very difficult for you, and it's very difficult for me, the people's betrayal. And God says to Moshe, "Ve'ata hanicha li vayichara pivahem v'achalem." Like, okay, I'm just going to destroy the people. I'll make you a great nation, Moshe. I'll start over. And Moshe's like wait a second. No, like my fate has become so bound up in these people that even though they drive me absolutely crazy, and even though there are so many moments when I just want to put down this burden, like my fate is inextricably bound up in their fate. And if you're gonna destroy the people, like, erase me too. And again, this is another death wish on the part of Moshe. It'll be a different kind of death wish. But I think what Moshe is saying here is like, I may not have wanted to bury these people, and it may be very, very difficult. But now that I'm responsible for them, I realize that my fate is so much bound up in theirs. And it really is this maternal ambivalence where Moshe resents his children for the toll they've taken on him, and wishes he could have more freedom. But at the same time, he can't imagine his life without them, without Bnei Israel, which is really kind of motherhood in a nutshell.
I love a lot of those descriptions. Obviously, they also relate deeply to my life as you're describing here in these last moments. I just want to bring in maybe two pieces. The first, bear with me, anyone, if I've said this before, but the whole concept of Moshe and his comparison to these maternal images, I think one of the greatest articles I ever read was one that really connected it all back to Moshe's birth, which is that Moshe is deeply impacted by the women who raise him and not necessarily by the men. And it's a very clear shift. In the second chapter of Shemot, the first, 10 psukim or so are like Moshe in the maternal world of those who physically raise him. And then, Vayigdal Moshe, Vayitze el Achav. It's very much, and then he goes out to the men's world, right? And the men's world is a rougher one, and they're not really looking to save him, and they're angry at him. And there's something about that beginning chapter of his life that all humans have, but it's very pronounced in his life because he's literally saved, not just brought into the world, but saved and remains in this world because of these women, that it sort of imprints his heart with this maternal image. And as you said, like he didn't really, I think, his relationship here with Am Yisrael kind of reminds me a lot of times of how I hear people describing, sorry to all the eldest out there, but their relationship with their first child, like there is, even if they really wanted very much that child, there's that first child is the one who takes away your freedom, quote unquote, is the one who sort of, who puts you into this role. And it's difficult, right? And then over time, you definitely feel yourself expanding, whether it's physically in pregnancy. All women know that feeling, literally, when they're like, no, I don't think my stomach can stretch anymore, right? And then it does. And also just like the feeling of, oh my goodness, how am I taking care of all these people right now? Like I can't physically do this. But I just want to mention sort of like a negative point, which is that to me, one of the reasons why Moshe really can't lead Am Yisrael after this is because of this sentence. Meaning, Rav Hirsch famously likes to read it for your benefit. Meaning, it was for your benefit that I won't be able to go in, because he wants to read this in a nicer way. But I think that the Pshat reading, as you said, is really like because of you, and the blame there feels really, really off. Honestly, it feels a little bit. It feels a little bit beneath Moshe. And there's a little bit of like a grudge there that, Rabbi Sachs famously speaks about, Moshe just wasn't the right leader anymore. He wasn't the right one to be leading them to Eretz Yisrael. He was the leader who wanted to be who sort of was in this maternal role. I'm going to do everything for you, but they really needed somebody else who was going to be more of a leader of teenagers, where he was more a leader of children, so to speak. And that was the difference between the first and second generation. And just the last piece, and I love to hear what you think about all of this, is that the criticism of Moshe is that he always has this idea that he's supposed to do everything himself. And it's very much the mother of small children, because ultimately we are supposed to enable them to be independent humans. And just like God famously slowly like pulls back throughout history, meaning that's ultimately what's supposed to happen. And Moshe constantly, like you said this in so many different beautiful ways in your teaching before, that, it's just too much for me. But like even in life, Ilana, when we're overwhelmed, usually the answer is that we have to delegate out. Like that's when we're overwhelmed, it's okay. So we have to, I can sit here and criticize my personality, or I could say like, these are the kochot I have right now. Now let me delegate out, like get cleaning help another day, or make less dinner, or have my kid do that, where, oh, clearly I'm doing too much. Somebody else has to. And I feel like that's constantly where Moshe struggles. He constantly constantly goes back to this trope of I have to do everything for them, but it's really the mindset of a parent of younger children as opposed
That's
to
why Yitro needs to sweep in. Absolutely. Like
exactly.
Moshe can't see that himself.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's his blind spot. It's his blind spot. The fact that he needs this help. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love what you brought about Moshe's early life and the role of the women and the mothers in his early life. My teacher, Aviva Zornberg, brings a beautiful midrash about how, right, Moshe, when he refuses to nurse, right in the midrash, refuses to nurse from Bat Paro, and that's why Bat Paro has to, right, ask Miriam to bring the Isha Meneket, who ends up, of course, being his mother, Yocheved, right? But Moshe says, right, my mouth that's going to nurse from my mouth that's going to speak with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, like my mouth is going to nurse from the breast of a woman, an Egyptian woman. That can't be, right, in the midrash. And it's like Moshe himself, as Aviva Zornberg says, has this very complicated nursing history and this very complicated infancy, right? He was, at 9 months thrown out of the house and put in the or, right? Yeah. And so for Moshe, the early stages of childhood, which is really the metaphorical stage, as you said, in which Bnei Israel are when he's accompanying them, right, with Yetziat Mitzrayim as the birth. And I love this idea of like they're reaching teenagerhood now. This period, this very, very fraught period and difficult period, right? Moshe, this is what for Moshe was so fraught in Moshe's childhood. Yeah. So, right, he's really working through, from a psychoanalytical perspective, we can say he's really working through his own complicated infancy and nursing. And it's no surprise that he invokes these metaphors and they're so powerful for him. And if we're talking, while I'm on the subject of my teacher, Aviva Zornberg, I just want to say, in terms of this metaphor that Moshe invokes, according to the Sifrei, this Vayit Aber, right? Aviva Zornberg connects it to something else. She says that, not to the Ibor, but she connects it to the Shoresh Avar, as in crossing over, right? That the great, the tremendous pain of Moshe's life, the tragedy of Moshe's life, right, is that, of course, he spends his whole life, right, preparing the people for a moment that he's not going to experience, which is really, again, this is motherhood, this is parenthood, right? Yeah, you're spending your whole life preparing your children so that they won't need you, right? And you're giving them everything you have and being there for them at every moment in the hope that they will reach a point where they can do it all without you, because eventually they'll have to, because God willing, your children will outlive you. That's the normal way of the world, God willing, right? And so in that, right, Moshe says, right, in the beginning of our parsha, or it's in the right, Moshe says, Ebrana ver et haaretz hatova hazot, right? Let me ebra from avar yitaber, same shoresh. Let me cross over. Let me go into the land, right? This is Moshe's most fervent wish, is to be able to cross over into the land. And instead, what God tells him is, no, right? Ale el har ha'avarim, right? You're going to go up to this mountain, which Aviva Zornberg very beautifully translates as the mountain of transitions. The same shoresh, avarim, vayitaber, e'ebra, right? This is Moshe's. This shoresh consumes Moshe, as it were, right? Because there's nothing he wants more than to be able to. And I have to say we don't in English have a language of roots in the same way as Hebrew is. So we miss so much in the translation. So I can only write as a translator, right? You try so hard to replicate the power and the levels of resonance in the original Hebrew. So I would say maybe that, right, Moshe pleads with God to let him cross over, right? His desire is thwarted by God, right? And God says to him, like, you're not going to be able to cross over. God crossly insists your life is over, as it were, right? An attempt to try to capture the power of that language, right? And it's really this plea and this disappointment that provide the drama and the pathos for the beginning of our parsha of Et Hanan. It's like Moshe has come to appreciate all the ways in which motherhood embraces these multiple meanings of avar, ibur, of all these terms. The pangs of labor have been so intense. And there have been moments when he's cried out to God that he simply can't bear it anymore. But at the same time, there's nothing he wants more than to continue with them. And his children they'll go farther and they'll live longer into the future than he will. And while he's full of hope for them, he's also really deeply saddened that he can't continue alongside of them.
I think also that there's the root of their ability to transition is in b'makli avarti et ha'yarden, meaning when we think about the of Yaakov Avinu, who paradigmatically becomes Am Yisrael, like their story is that they're going to have to transition, right? As, let's say, the children, as they're growing up, they are the ones who are going to have to cross over those rivers and make it to the other side. They might lose things along the way. They might have struggle along the way, but B'diuk, Moshe is not part of that same story.
You spoke about the grudge that Moshe bears against the people, which is, we almost, as you said, it's almost like beneath him. But I think it's important to remember, we think of Dvarim, right? And Dvarim, Sefer Dvarim describes itself, right, as the Mishneh Torah, right? That it's a second Torah, that it's repeating much of what we've read about in the previous 3 books of the Torah. The Tosfot in Masechet Gittin explained that the book of Dvarim is referred to that way because it reviews and repeats what we've seen previously. She'ino ela chozer v'shoneh mashelamala. And indeed, it's true. Much of the book consists of Moshe's summation of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Mamad Har Sinai, everything that happens in the Midbar. But really, as our parsha, I think especially our parsha in particular demonstrates, Sefer Dvarim is really more of a personal interpretation than a repetition. And as a result, we find things like Moshe's tremendous grudge against the people, that Moshe's address to the people in Dvarim, it doesn't unfold chronologically. It unfolds episodically, right? Moshe begins, right? He begins really in media res. Like he starts with having to leave Sinai, right? And then in chapters 9 and 10, he goes back to talk about Mamad Har Sinai, right? And this is really Moshe's version of events. And he's really free to tell it as he sees fit, piecing together the episodes into a narrative whose internal logic may make sense to him alone. But this is really, the way I think of Sefer Dvarim, I really think of it as Moshe's memoir. And I think, with the genre of memoir, many people make the mistake of thinking, oh, a memoir is like, it's like your diary entry, or it's like a history of your life, right? It's like your Divrei Hayamim or whatever, but it's not, right? The nature of memoir as a genre is that it's a very deeply personal account of what happened, interwoven with the memoirist's emotional responses. And so, alongside the mundane details, of, where Bnei Israel encamped and how long they were there and the rivers they crossed and battling Sichon and Og, and we find this in Dvarim, but even these seemingly quotidian accounts are very much colored by Moshe's anger and frustration and resentment. And that is so much a part of Sefer Dvarim. Aviva Zornberg describes the beginning of Et Hanan as the most personal of Moshe's speeches. It's uniquely confessional. And Moshe, right, as Aviva Zornberg says, he repeats again and again the I here, right? This is the I of Sefer Dvarim is Moshe's voice, unlike all the other books of the Torah, right? And so Moshe is really, he's giving an account of himself that is essentially creating his past self. His retellings of the people's history are animated by his autobiographical I. It's very much, right? This is Moshe's book because it's inflected by his sensibility. It's not just a Mishneh Torah because it's as much about Moshe's inner life as it is about the people's history. And this very, very much reminds me of there's a, just the idea that all throughout Sefer Dvarim, right, Moshe interjects and interrupts even at points that feels almost awkward to get out his anger or to share something personal. We see it a bit later in our parsha also, where Moshe's in the middle of talking about Mamad Har Sinai, right? Yom Asher Amadta Lifnei Hashem Elokecha Bechorev, right? This day you stood before God at Sinai, but he interrupts in the very next pasuk. He says, Vadonai hit anafbi al divrechem vayishava levilti ovri et hayarden ulevilti vo el haaretz, right? You know what, says Moshe, as he's in the middle of describing Sinai, he says, and God got really angry at me because of you. And it's almost like, Moshe can't contain himself. It reminds me of that moment of, Lishuatcha kiviti ad Hashem, right, in Vayechi, right? And when Yaakov, it's like this sudden interjection of I'm so angry that even though I'm telling you about your history and I'm preparing you for everything you need to know to enter the land, I have this anger, and it so much reminds me of a moment in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, where she talks about, she's right, the whole premise of the book is that Virginia Woolf is supposed to give an address about women in fiction, and she's thinking to herself, like, why haven't women written more fiction? And really, she says, why haven't women written better fiction? Why isn't there a female Shakespeare, right? Why didn't Shakespeare's sister write plays like Shakespeare, she asks. And her answer, she says, and she rereads passages from Jane Eyre, and she rereads passages from Pride and Prejudice within A Room of One's Own. And she says, you know what? It's because in order to be a great writer, the mind of the writer has to be incandescent, right? A great writer has here, I have it here somewhere. I can just read you this one line. She says, the mind of an artist, in order to achieve the prodigious effort of freeing whole and entire the work that is in him, the mind of an artist must be incandescent, like Shakespeare's mind, with no obstacle in it, no foreign matter unconsumed. And she points to this moment in Jane Eyre where Charlotte Bronte is in the middle of describing Jane's awareness that there's, she hears laughter coming from the attic. It's, of course, we know it's Rochester's, right? It's Grace Poole, Rochester's, right? But we know what it is. But she interjects in the moment of the narrative to say, it's so unfair that women have to confine themselves to embroidering bags, to knitting stockings. And Virginia Woolf points to this moment in Jane Eyre, and she says, this is a flaw with Bronte's writing. It's a flaw with Bronte's writing because Bronte can't write like Shakespeare. She doesn't have the incandescent mind because she has so much anger. She bears such a grudge at the status of women in her society that she can't go on with her narrative fiction about Jane Eyre and Rochester and Grace Poole. She can't keep telling the story. And it's so much like this moment in Sefer Dvarim where Moshe, who has to interject his account of the people's history to share his personal grievance that he can't enter the land, that the story he's trying to tell gets interrupted. His mind, Moshe's mind, like that of Woolf's rendering of Charlotte Bronte or Woolf's imagined Judith Shakespeare, his mind can't be incandescent. It can't be without flaw, without grudge. And while Woolf would see this as a flaw, I think that Sefer Dvarim is really all the richer for it because we get this unique window into what it was like to be Moshe that we don't have elsewhere in Chamisha Chumshei Torah.
I think also that I agree with you that it's an advantage, that it's a positive element of the Torah. And I think I would even say it maybe in two additional reasons. One is because, again, we're not Moshe, but we have a whole big portion of at least one of the books of Chamisha Chumshei Torah that are devoted to this personal rendition. And I think that there is a sort of paradigm there of saying, like, again, we're not Moshe, but we have to make Torah our own. And so that means that we might hear things a little bit differently sometimes. It might mean we have a slightly different interpretation or that there's room for multiple interpretations. Like, I think there's also, there's sort of a statement here about the importance of making Torah personal. That's like one piece. And I think that there's something wonderful about the fact that Moshe as a leader is not presented as sort of a flat form. And we don't experience him as flat in the previous books, but as you're saying here, even when he chooses how he wants to tell, he's not flat either. Meaning even when he could have chosen to tell a prettier version of the years that happened and to whitewash or to, express himself as this leader who was flawless, but he also doesn't do that. And I think that that's also this great thing. I actually just wanted to share one story, which is that I recently took part in this, I'm still in this cohort of Rabbi Sachs scholars through the Rabbi Sachs legacy. And we were on this amazing five-day seminar. And one of the evenings, the first evening actually of the seminar, was an evening where they really spoke about his personality and his figure. And the people who were on the panel were people who worked very, very closely with Rabbi Sachs. And it was kind of a Hasidic Rebbe story without the Hasidic and the Rebbe part. And so what was so great about it was that they were really speaking about him very honestly. And they weren't saying, oh, here are his flaws in the way that people today like to say, oh, look how flawed we are. and that's something phenomenal. Meaning, it was here's his greatness, but they were also being realistic about the limits of those greatness. And I think that to me, at least in the way that I look up to people, was very, very inspiring and moving, much more than like a fantastical sort of like Rebbe kind of story.
And I think part of what's happening in our Parsha is that it's really our chance to get everything right, to for Moshe to air his grievances and for us to hear it all from Moshe's perspective. And this is drawn out as much as the opening of our Parsha is so impassioned. It's drawn out even more so in the midrash, where and I see it in the Tanchuman Ve'Chanan. There is such an attempt to really, right. Aviva Zornberg writes in her book about Moshe. She calls it Moshe, a human life, which is taken from Kafka, but it really speaks to what you just addressed about how really we're getting our leaders are so human, and in that sense they really can be models for us, right? As mothers, as we spoke about before, as human beings, right? In all the capacities in which we find ourselves leading, right? Moshe really can be such a model because he's not flawless. And that's so much drawn out in the midrash, where Moshe's really, he's like driven to desperation, right? In this Ve'Chanan moment, it's like, right, the midrash reads Ve'Chanan as, right, taking the shoresh of Chanan as being matanat chinam, right? That what is matnat chinam? What is Moshe saying? Like, he's not asking God to accede to his demands because of any merit he has. He's saying, God, please, out of sheer grace, I may not deserve it. Fine, I get that. I did things wrong. Fine. But please just grant me this opportunity. Grant me this gift of being allowed to enter. But Moshe just will not relent. And as obvious as it is, Moshe's persistence, his perseverance, as apparent as it is in the beginning of our parsha, even more so in the midrash, like should hands that have licked, right? Should hands that have received the Torah from your hands, God, lick the dust and be buried in the ground, right? It's not appropriate, right? Moshe has no ego here. He's just trying. He's grasping at straws here. Anything he can do to be allowed to enter, right? The Chizkuni says that it's about Moshe saying, if only, I just want to be able to do the mitzvot, right? I just want to be able to, right? Moshe will say anything so that God will let him in. And again, Moshe has not yet resigned himself to his fate. And it's not really clear if Moshe ever resigns himself to his fate. And I wonder sometimes if that's the meaning of Moshe dying with his full vigor when the Torah tells us lo chataino v'lo naslecho in the last parak of the Torah, that's what it means. Moshe has not given up the fight. He has not gone gentle into that good night.
I think, by the way, that if one of the themes that we've been looking at is sort of this idea about what Am Yisrael are supposed to develop into, we don't have time to unpack it here, but I think that there's a really big question about what old age looks like, because I think that that's a big internal battle that Moshe is fighting here. He's saying, okay, maybe I even get, according to some of the midrashim you've brought, that my role that I filled up until now is no longer appropriate. So I'll be something else. But I feel that what this is really representing is this question that people, let's say, who retire deal with, of what does this next stage look like? Am I a dimmed version of what I was before? Am I going to be doing something else? Am I just supposed to be a cow sent out to pasture? Meaning, I think that that's also sitting at the root, meaning it's sort of this parent who says, I'm not ready to shift my role. I don't want to, or maybe even not able to recognize that they need to. And I think that there's a real question here about what is old age supposed to look like? Is it supposed to be, as you said, the Midrash says, that he never loses his spark, meaning is what we're supposed to be striving towards a life where we're sort of living at our greatest vitality up until the last moment? And obviously there are going to be multiple ways to live out that last chapter of one's life in different ways that are successful. But I think that at the root of what Moshe is struggling with here is, what does that last chapter look like? Is it a chapter where I have to pull back? Is it a chapter where I have to push forward but push differently? And I think that that's a lot of the tension that the Midrashim are really bringing up here.
Yes, and you're reminding me of two poems that both speak about the different ways that people can die. And, there's Dylan Thomas's "Do not go gentle into that good night, rage, rage against the dying of the light." Really, right? The poet is saying, like, don't let death get the better of you. Fight it till the last moment. It's like David with Malach HaMavet. Don't let anyone snatch your soul. Versus John Donne in a poem, one of my favorite poems, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. John Donne compares the way he calls it virtuous men die versus he doesn't, the non-virtuous, right? He says, as virtuous men go mildly to their graves, some say the breath goes now and some say no, right? You can't even tell when a virtuous man is dying because it's so subtle, the way the soul, it's like dying with the nishika, right? It's so subtle. Whereas there's the tears and sigh tempests, right, of the people who are raging against the dying of the light, as it were. And you get the sense with Moshe that he can't go gentle into that good night.
No,
he can't stop for death. He to invoke Dickinson, like he really he's not ready because he's given this everything he has. So I have a project of writing a Shakespearean sonnet on every Parsha in the Torah that I worked on. I've been working on this past year. I'm finishing up now. I started with Breshit. So I thought maybe I'd read my sonnet for Vet Hanan. It's written with every second and fourth line rhyming in iambic pentameter and then a couplet at the end, like a Shakespearean sonnet. And it's really an attempt, I think, to draw out the poetry that I think is inherent in Torah. Sometimes I puzzle at the fact that Torah is not written with line breaks. It's so poetic. And really the idea behind this project was to try to showcase the beautiful poetry that's already part of our Torah. So I wrote the one on Vet Hanan. I wrote about the opening psukim that we've been discussing, Moshe's plea to be allowed to enter the land based on all the midrashim we've discussed. I plead with you, beseech you, let me in. I can't go gentle into that good night. I still have strength, my eyes remain undimmed. I rage against the dying of the light. With whom shall I seek mercy for myself? All others you forgive, God. Why not me? I made a few mistakes, as do all men. It doesn't mean I acted faithlessly. A slave, we learn, can choose to be a slave for life, his master pierces in his ear. I love you, God. I don't want to go free. I want to stay your slave, God. Do you hear? And fair enough, if Joshua must serve you in my stead, I'll gladly cede my role. But let me be his protege instead, and let his name adorn the Torah scroll. Should hands that took the Torah from your hands, should feet that climbed up Sinai toward the sky now lick the dust? For 40 days I ate no food and drank no water. Now I die? Just let me in for 1 year, so I might perform all the commandments in the land. And if I cannot enter when alive, then let me in when dead, so I demand. Enough, said God to me, your life is through. Since you can't stop for death, he'll stop for you.
Ilana, I just want to end with one thought, which is that for years I've been studying and teaching, I guess some like to call it a sort of literary theological approach to the Torah. And what I think is most exciting about this meeting that we've had together is that you live a literary approach to Torah, which is much more of a full body experience than I think mine is. And so I really, really am so happy that our audience has been able to see that. Not many people who are well versed in Torah are also quoting John Donne, and obviously they remember the plot line of A Room of Her Own, or it's whatever. I'm getting the title wrong, right? Meaning all of these things that some of us were supposed to read in high school. And it's amazing, and I'm really looking forward to that memoir that you sneakily snuck in there in the bio, because it's an amazing thing also that obviously you're raising kids in this kind of environment where there's a really organic relationship between all of the wisdom and obviously a clear hierarchy, but a really beautiful organic relationship between all of the things that most inspire you. So I'm so happy that we were able to get a little bit of a taste of that.
Thank you so much, Yosefa.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.